Hello once again, students. So I finished my lecture on meditation 2, and this is going to be a bare bones lecture on meditations 3 and 4. I'm really trying to be brief here because we want to focus on the wax meditation, in other words, the end of meditation 2 and meditation 6 in week 3. Those are the 2 points of focus, but we do need to know a little bit about what happened in meditations 3 and 4, not so much meditation 5. We can safely ignore that. Right, so let me just sort of give you bullet points or, mostly conclusions without getting into the argumentation. As you've seen, normally I want to get into the arguments. How does Descartes argue for this, justify it, explain it? We'll try to stay at a somewhat superficial level here deliberately. Okay, so in meditation 3, the first main thing that happens is Descartes develops criteria for truth, right? Criteria, I know you've heard the word, you got to think about what that means concretely. Standards for truth, conditions that need to be met, right? That's what we're talking about. Criteria for truth. What are the criteria for truth? Having a clear and distinct perception of something, of a proposition, say, is a mark of truth, right? And that sounds familiar, right? Descartes mentioned clear and distinct perceptions in the discourse. Okay, and then in meditation 3, he's very clear. Oh, I remember in meditation 2, I came to the conclusion that I was a thinking thing and I was completely certain of it. And why was that? Well, I had a clear and distinct perception of myself as a thinking thing. So, clear and distinct perception is said to be a mark of truth, right? And sometimes I say CDP, so I'll just go ahead and warn you in case I say it later. I had an instructor in graduate school who went on and on about CDPs all the time. Descartes has a CDP of this and a CDP of that, and so sometimes it'll just fly out of my mouth. Okay, so that's the mark of truth. So then Descartes asks the question, well, do I have any CDPs in my mind that I didn't really notice because I wasn't thinking in terms of CDPs yet? Right, now that I know what the mark of truth is, let me look around in my mind and look at my ideas and see if there are CDPs in there. Yes, of course there are. A lot of the CDPs in his mind are in the area of mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, algebra. Okay, so he does have a bunch of CDPs. He doesn't immediately say, though, oh, good, math is rehabilitated. Now we can trust math. No, instead he says, but I had this worry that God was messing with my mind and, making me believe things, propositions in mathematics that aren't really true. So if I could get past that worry, then mathematics will be rehabilitated, right? Then I can trust math again. So what do we do about this God worry? Well, we could prove that there's a God and prove that God is not only good but infinitely good. And then so that's what Descartes proceeds to do. And I'll get into the argumentation enough just to say, well, the argument depends on this idea that some ideas have more reality, more objective reality than others. Let me say that again altogether. That didn't go very smoothly. The proof for God in Meditation 3 depends on the claim that some ideas have more objective reality than others. What is objective reality, you ask? Well, I will make a terminological point here. Formal reality is out there in the world, which sounds weird, but it's in line with Aristotelian terminology. Unfortunately, Aristotle's having an influence again, right? So for Aristotle, formal causation is something that takes place out there in the world. It's going on in my body all the time. It's the form of my body that allows me to be able to speak, for instance. Right? So if we talk about my soul enabling or causing me to speak, well, my soul is the form of my body for Aristotle. Right? We didn't really get into that last week, but that is part of Aristotle's view. So formal causation is something that happens a lot in the world, and formal reality is out there, though that sounds odd. When we say objective reality, we're thinking of ideas as objects that we relate to mentally. So objective reality is the kind that ideas have. Right? So the terminology is the terminology here is the opposite of what you would expect. Formal reality is out there. Objective reality is the reality of ideas. Ideas considered as objects of my consciousness, of my mind. Okay, so some ideas have more objective reality than others. What does that mean? What does that come down to exactly? Well, ideas represent things. So what Descartes is saying is, as representations, some ideas are more complex than others, and not only are they complex, but especially if they have a coherent complexity, it actually hangs together, Complexity is greater perfection and thus greater reality, as far as Descartes is concerned. So in other words, I'm a terrible artist and I don't know hardly anything about architecture or engineering, so I could draw a picture of a house and it would be a disaster, it would be a mess, it would be ludicrous, you couldn't do anything with it. And then imagine someone who has degrees in architecture and engineering and is actually a good artist. Maybe it's just natural to them, good for them. Right? And they draw up these elaborate plans for a house. Okay, well that's going to have more objective reality than the silly little drawing that I produced. Okay, so for one idea to have more objective reality is for it to have a more coherent complexity to it. Okay? And that has to be accounted for. Right? This other person that I'm imagining created an image with more coherent complexity because of the training that person had received, right? I mentioned degrees in architecture and engineering. So there's a lot of training. That also came from somewhere. It went into this person's head and then it got spit out on the paper. So some ideas have more objective reality than others, and then that has to be accounted for somehow. And that's basically the basis for Descartes' argument. He goes on to claim that his idea of God is infinite, right? As objective reality, it's infinite, right? Because that idea of God is the idea of infinite attributes that are infinite in their own dimensions, right? In other words, God is strong, how strong, infinitely strong. God is wise, how wise, infinitely wise. God is just, how just, infinitely just. But, fill out the list yourself. So somehow we could make a list of perfections, but we probably wouldn't capture them all. So there's this idea of an unbounded or infinite list of perfections. They all belong to God, right? And yet God is simple, right? In other words, God is not divisible, right? So God is like, God doesn't really exist in space. He transcends, or she transcends space and time. But in a way, God exists as this single infinite point, not spatially, but that's how simple God is. So God is like wrapping all these perfections into this beautiful simplicity, right? And so what you're dealing with there is infinite complexity, but also coherent, right? Or so the theologians will tell us. They'll get to work and they'll make it coherent. Okay. So the objective reality of the idea of God is so great that it can't be accounted for by appealing to any finite substance, including me. So I have formal reality, right? But my formal reality isn't great enough to account for the objective reality that we find in the idea of God. So we actually need something within formal reality that's infinite to account for the infinity we see in the formal reality of the idea of God. Is that clear? Does that completely make sense? I wouldn't exactly say so myself, but that is the argument, right? I'm finite. There seem to be two considerations here. I'm almost done with meditation 3. There seem to be two considerations here. I'm finite, and I could add up my reality again and again, like Jeff times 5, right? And you get 5 Jeff Ogles, and maybe 5 Jeff Ogles is smarter and definitely stronger than just one. But summing up, adding, isn't going to do you any good. You're not going to get to the infinite that way, right? You have to give the infinite to get the infinite. If you added up Jeff Ogles, who are finite, over infinite time, you could get to the infinite. So if you just take Jeff Ogle and he's just finite and you don't have infinite time, you just get the finite from the finite. So there's this gap between the finite and the infinite, right? And we don't know how to get to the infinite from the finite. So that's consideration number 1. That's why the idea of God, which is infinite, suggests there's something actually infinite out there that the idea is based on. Right? But then, we should also say, Descartes says, this idea is prior to my other ideas. Not in time, or not necessarily in time, but logically prior. So that's consideration number 2. That is to say, Descartes raises this issue, well, how do I know I'm finite? How do I know I have doubts? How do I know I'm so limited? Because somewhere in me, somewhere in my consciousness is an idea of perfection and infinity. And I know that I fall short because of that idea. So, how can we say, I have an idea of the infinite, therefore there's an actually infinite being? 2 things. Insurmountable gap between the finite and the infinite. So if I only have experience of the finite, like myself, my own mind and soul and body, I can't really get to the infinite. Not really. There's an insurmountable gap. Consideration number 2, that idea of the infinite is prior to the idea of the finite. I couldn't really understand myself as finite without the idea of the infinite already being there, already being operative. Okay. Therefore there's a God, therefore God is infinitely good, therefore I can trust math again. Hooray! Huzzah! Okay. So meditation 4, that wasn't bad for meditation 3. It's very long in the text, right? Okay, 15 minutes, pretty good. I think we can be even shorter when it comes to meditation 4. Okay, meditation 4 is really about this tension, this paradox, if you like. First of all, God is good. How good? Infinitely good. We just established that in meditation 3. God is infinitely good, and yet I am subject to errors. I make errors. I'm prone to them. What gives, right? God is also infinitely powerful. All right, so God is infinitely powerful, therefore God can produce whatever God wants and can make it as good as God wants, and God is infinitely good, so then has a desire to make everything good. So why do I make errors? Okay, well, point number 1, I am finite, and I participate in self-sufficient being, so I'm God-like. I'm not God, but I'm God-like. I have some power and some wisdom and some justice, and so God is off the scale because God's infinite. But I'm on the scale, and the scale is going toward God. So I'm participating in the spectrum of being to which God belongs, but I'm finite, so I'm also just bounded. I stop. Right, like my wisdom starts and it goes and then it stops and it doesn't get past that point. So I participate in nothingness. I participate in self-sufficient being, but I also participate in nothingness. I'm in this middle of the road place. So, first attempt to resolve the tension, error comes from nothing. Error is nothing because it comes from nothing, right? Okay, well that sounds pretty good. I mean, you would think maybe that Descartes could end meditation 4 there, right? Well, I'm partly God and I'm partly nothing, and the error that I make comes from the nothing part. He doesn't quite want to stop there. Because he comes back to the point that, well, God could have made me perfectly good. Well, what about that? What about the fact that God could have made me perfectly good and then didn't? Right? Doesn't that seem to mean God didn't give me everything God should have given me, which would make God bad or negligent or something? It would reflect badly on God. So, couple things. There's what we call the tapestry argument. We in philosophy, at least, and sometimes people in theology, we talk about the tapestry argument. What do we mean by that? We mean when you judge creation, God's creation, don't look at individuals, look at the universe. God didn't just create individuals like one at a time. God created a universe. Right? So, is the universe good? Not is Jeff Ogle good. Was Jeff Ogle well created? I don't know. But the universe is good, right? There's lots of... Descartes' kind of big on diversity, actually, in his way. So there's lots of diversity in it, lots of different kinds of things. They all cohere together in this beautiful whole. So the universe is a beautiful tapestry, right? That's why it's called the tapestry argument. If you pick out an individual strand or something and try to look at it, it's not going to look that great. Look at the whole. Look at the whole. It's a good whole, right? I mean, like, for instance, I'm going to die. I'm mortal. I'm finite. But, I've got kids, and I'm raising them, and they're going to go out into the world on their own, and so my wisdom and knowledge and this visage, beautiful visage that you see before you, it will pass away. But, I will have an impact. I am training the kids, helping them grow up to be beneficial human beings to the rest of humanity. And so the great tapestry will go on and get better over time, I think. Right, so don't worry, the universe is good, right? But we're not quite done. We're close. If error is nothing and comes from nothing, can we be more specific? I mean, that's basically what Descartes ends up asking. Can we be more specific than that? Well, yes, we can. He says, when I make an error, there are always two causes operating at the same time. My intellect and my will. So let's consider them separately and try to figure out more precisely where the error is coming from, where the nothing creeps in, if you like. Okay, so the intellect, what it does when I make a judgment and end up making an error, because it's a bad judgment, what the intellect does is it grasps an idea. It's a perceiver, not a sensory perceiver, but rather the intellect perceives ideas, right? Or at least we have to understand the intellect through that analogy. It perceives, it grasps. That's its job. Does it do a bad job? No. Does a good job. Especially if you give it a clear and distinct perception or a clear and distinct idea, then it grasps the idea perfectly well, right? It's just that it doesn't have all the CDPs there are, or all the possible CDPs. So the intellect itself is finite and participates in the nothingness, doesn't have all the CDPs, but that doesn't mean it's ill-formed, right? It's perfectly good, but limited, okay? We'll come back to that in a second. The will is not limited and is perfectly good. The will is the faculty of choice, so the will's role in a judgment is to affirm or deny. So the intellect grasps an idea, like, 2 + 2 = 4, let me look at that. And the will says, yeah, it really does equal 4. It affirms, or, 2 + 2 = 3. I'll look at that with my intellect. And my will denies, no, that's not true, right? Doesn't equal 3, right? And there's no limitation on the will. The will could affirm or deny any idea, even if you don't understand it very well. That's what makes error possible. So intellect is limited and doesn't have all the CDPs. Will is unlimited. It's actually godlike, right? The will is the reason I'm said to be made in the image of God, which is a line from Genesis, in case you don't know. So I'm made in the image of God, says Descartes, because of my perfect will. So my will isn't limited. My will can affirm or deny anything. CDPs, non-CDPs, doesn't matter. So there's this gap between the scope of the intellect and the scope of the will. The intellect doesn't have access to all the CDPs, but the will can affirm or deny any ideas at all, no matter how clear, no matter how distinct, no matter how unclear, no matter how indistinct. So there's a gap between the scope of the two faculties. And what's a gap? it's nothing. It doesn't have a positive existence. It's just that you put the intellect here and you put the will here, and you look and you see that relative to each other they're not lining up. So a gap is a nothing, right? So okay, so now we've been more precise, right? Where does error come from? Nothing. Can we say more? Yes. Well, there's the intellect and the will, and the intellect grasps the ideas and the will affirms or denies them, but the intellect only has access to so many good ideas, and the will can affirm or deny any of them, whether they're good or they're crummy or they're clear or they're unclear or whatever, right? And so there's a gap, but a gap is nothing. And why is error possible? Because of the gap, which is nothing, right? So it's my participation in nothingness that makes error possible, so don't blame God, right? I mean, that's really what meditation 4 is about. Hey, don't blame God because you made errors. Be more careful. Well, all you have to do is remember about the gap, and then tell yourself, I will only make a judgment when I have a relevant, clear, and distinct perception. And if I limit myself to those cases in which I have relevant, clear, and distinct perceptions, then I'll make perfectly good judgments. All right. It's been fun.